Hi everyone, I'm Matt from Cairo. I'm part of the Mobilise team. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to hand over to the team in a moment, but a few housekeeping bits before we start, if I may, please. The first thing is, as you'll see on your screen here, today's presentation is being recorded. We're doing this so that non-attending schools in Lincolnshire can view it back on our YouTube channel after the event, and you can also take a look back at it if there's anything you want to revisit. The recording will be available until the end of spring term 2021. Now, the recording will be stopped at the end of the session. So if there's any questions you'd like to ask after that point, you can do that without it being recorded, and that will be absolutely fine. If I could ask everybody, please, to turn your cameras off and make sure you are muted for the moment. We will invite questions as necessary, but for the time being, please stay quiet and invisible. Thank you very much. Right, Vanessa, all yours.
Thank you, Matt. Okay, so thank you very much for choosing to spend an hour of your busy day with us. We're delighted to welcome colleagues from primary, secondary, special and alternative provision. Many of you have been involved in projects with us during the past 4 years, and we're really excited to be sharing an overview of what each project will cover until July 2022. So, as with anything, the more you put in, the more you'll get out. We know from the past 4 years that Mobilise has greater impact where schools choose projects that are linked to whole school priorities. The PLC model, which Anna will talk a little bit more about for those of you who are new to Mobilise, will continue, bringing together clusters of schools that benefit from that collaboration, discussing the implications of a piece of reading in their own context and committing to short-term actions that will impact on outcomes. The evidence suggests that the most effective CPD for sustained improvement is implemented over a period of time. Hence, most of the projects will run until July 2022. We're also very aware that leading a Mobilise project in the school has provided many opportunities for development of leadership skills, both in school and beyond, for school-based leads and also cluster leads within their own school and beyond. Thanks, Matt. So you might be asking, why is Mobilise relevant during a pandemic? Whilst we understand many of you are consumed with crisis management right now, and it's understandably difficult to see beyond of the current school day, we all know education of our children and young people can't stand still. So we're not only addressing local and national priorities, we're also mindful that projects should respond to the context we're in without being overshadowed by it. So the projects will focus on what's important now and in the future. Things like mental health, a coherent curriculum that builds on prior knowledge, a reliance on disciplinary literacy skills and independent study skills, ensuring foundations in maths and literacy are secure and transitions are smooth. Thanks, Matt. So hopefully you received the project overview, which gives you a little bit of detail about each of the projects. And this is available on the homepage of our website if you haven't had a chance to access it yet. So there are 6 completely new projects and 1 which is a completion of Emotional Health and Wellbeing 1. I'll now hand over to Anna to talk you through the PLC model.
Thanks, Vanessa. Okay, so the Mobilise structure. So all of our projects are either 5 PLCs or 10 PLCs long, so 5 or 10 meetings. If you opt for a 10 PLC project, it will commence in January 21 and complete in July 2022, apart from the ILS project for secondary schools, which does begin earlier than that in the autumn term. So the colleagues that will speak to you today during this meeting are the research champions for each of the projects. The research champions structure each project, ensure the research selected for each PLC is the best available research and is accessible for schools. Research champions also create and collate resources for the Mobilise website. Research champions provide ongoing support to cluster leads who are school-based leads that are volunteered or put forward by their schools to do the extra role of leading the cluster group and facilitating the PLC meetings. Research champions will provide ongoing advice and support to cluster leads throughout the duration of the project. If schools put forward a cluster lead, the cluster lead will receive training with the research champion before they lead each PLC meeting to ensure they're fully prepared to facilitate their meetings. And schools will receive funding towards the cost of the cluster lead's time for this. Due to the current situation, PLCs will initially be all virtual, but this will be reviewed as and when government guidance is updated. Thanks, Matt. So what is a PLC? What do we mean by that? So as its name suggests, it's a group of professionals coming together for a structured purpose, to learn, to share expertise and work collaboratively to improve teaching skills and outcomes for pupils. So usually we group schools in clusters of around 8 to 12 schools, and each school will nominate a school-based lead to attend each PLC meeting. So the same school-based lead attends each meeting. The school-based lead also leads the project back in school and facilitates shadow PLCs back in school as well. It's important that schools carefully select their school-based lead, so someone who's going to be really invested in the project and who has the capacity to lead on the project back in school. PLCs are 90 minutes long, except for emotional health and mental health and behaviour meetings are a little bit longer because we have support from county agencies and services in those meetings, so that does add a little bit of additional time. But the PLC 90-minute part of the meeting is the same for whichever project you decide to take on. And the meetings always start with feedback and review of progress against action plans. So schools have an opportunity to have time together to review action plans set during the last meeting, and they'll discuss these together, discuss the challenges, problem solve together, and share successes as well. The next part of the meeting is then reading and engaging in the research, and there's plenty of time then for professional discussion and dialogue around that reading. The cluster leads facilitate that and lead that discussion with support from the research champions. And it really is about everybody having a voice within that meeting and everybody really being involved in that discussion. The last part of every meeting is action planning. So schools are given time in the meeting to create their action plans. They're short-term actions which are linked specifically to the reading and evidence base shared within the meeting. School-based leads are supported in creating those action plans by their cluster lead, the research champion, and any other attending agencies and services within the meeting. Thanks, Matt. So where Mobilise projects have seen the most impact is where the project is based on a whole school development priority and the project is prioritised and promoted by the senior leadership team. So school-based leads will need time to lead that project in school. They'll need time to monitor and evaluate action plans and to meet with SLT regularly to update them on the progress of the project and evaluate action plans collaboratively. School-based leads will need to book in CPD sessions within the school CPD calendar to guarantee time for them to lead shadow PLCs back in school. A shadow PLC is a replication of the PLC meeting attended by the school-based lead. Support and resources will be given to the school-based lead so that they can effectively lead that meeting back in school. And by doing that, it ensures that the project has impact across the school and engagement across the whole school, rather than just impacting on that one professional or that one classroom. So it's really important that that shadow PLC is booked in and takes place after each PLC meeting. Thanks, Matt.
Okay, so we're going to start looking in a little bit more detail at each of the new projects. And the first we're going to look at is curriculum planning. So here you can see the proposed coverage of PLCs, areas which weren't covered in either curriculum design year 1 or curriculum design year 2. So if you took part in a curriculum design project previously, or even if you didn't take part in that previously, this will be relevant to you. It's applicable to all phases, and this is a 5 PLC project. So when Gove and Gibb talk about exposing disadvantage to experiences that more privileged have, going to talk to you a little bit about one of those PLCs. Obviously, it's not time to talk about all of them, so I'm just going to talk about the cultural capital one. Ofsted interpreted the term cultural capital, a term created by Pierre Bourdieu in the 1970s, to mean what pupils bring to school from their society as well as what they take away. To be a phrase which will be familiar to those of you that know the Ofsted framework, the essential knowledge needed to be educated citizens, introducing them to the best that has been thought and said, helping pupils to appreciate human creativity and achievement. A number of studies by the Sutton Trust and Social Mobility Commission show strong evidence that recruitment into top professions is made easier by the level of cultural capital of applicants. The evidence suggests cultural capital passed on through families helps children do better in school. However, the term cultural capital is not a description of what the curriculum offers, it's about inclusivity. What we think is culturally important stays fixed for a long time, and in modern times it's about Lincolnshire schools defining the cultural capital that their children need, teaching what's widely known and being able to critique and debate it, discussing its value, creating space for them to create their own meaning and sense from it without reinforcing notions of class structure. We'll also explore in that PLC Peterson's term cultural omnivore, someone who mixes interests in a wide range of forms, cultural, both historically accepted and also those which are emerging. We'll explore 4 types of cultural capital: objective, embodied, technical, and institutionalised. So that just gives you a little bit of flavour of what that one will cover. Thanks, Nat. So I'll also be research champion for metacognition self-regulation. This is a 10 PLC model, which again is suitable for all phases. So there's a very strong evidence base that the Education Endowment Foundation suggests can lead to up to 7 months when implemented effectively. And those of you familiar with the toolkit will know that it also is one of the ones that costs the least to implement. It also benefits lower attainers, so it may help close that attainment gap, particularly again at this time where schools are thinking about that attainment gap that may have widened during the period of lockdown. Strategies will depend on the context, so it's a project that can impact across all subjects. Teachers and teaching assistants will learn how to explicitly teach, model, scaffold strategies so that children and young people learn to plan, monitor and evaluate their learning, choosing strategies for memory and self-regulation, and we'll look at behaviours such as motivation. Thanks, Matt. So the project will inevitably be based on the EEF's guidance report and the 7 recommendations and the evidence that sits behind those. For now, I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about recommendation 3 and 4, so that we will look at so modelling the strategies using the research by Fisher and Frey from 2013, which looks at a framework for gradual release of responsibility. Again, something particularly relevant at this time when some of the children and young people in your schools you may be finding need a little bit more scaffolding at a higher level than they did previous to lockdown. And also recommendation 4 will look at some of the more recent evidence presented by Beata Sudas that looks at what it takes to motivate our children. And the Flavel model, which states that students who aren't motivated to complete tasks may struggle with self-reflection. So we'll be looking at teaching self-evaluation skills and what finished work looks like. Thanks, Matt. Just hand over to Rachel.
Hello everyone, I'm the research champion for the early years Key Stage 1 maths, and the focus for the PLCs here will be the EEF documentation Improving Maths in Early Years in Key Stage 1, which is the precursor to the Improving Maths in Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3. Now, overall, this guidance recognises the importance of great maths teaching in the early years to ensure that gaps do not emerge as the children progress further through the school. The guidance itself states that there is a strong link between a child's early mathematical understanding and later school achievement. And this is going to be of particular importance this year due to the long periods of absence from school, and children are now at different starting points. The guidance itself provides an excellent supporting document with practical ideas for implementation. Discussing issues and concerns around teaching mathematics through the pandemic will form part of our maths PLCs, along with sharing practice. However, sitting alongside this will be carefully selected evidence-based research which addresses each of the 5 recommendations from the guidance. The aim is to promote high-quality professional discussion about how we can support children early on their mathematical journey during these challenging times. The 5 main areas of focus will be to develop practitioners' understanding of how children learn mathematics, and here the emphasis will be on mathematical pedagogy, including teacher knowledge on concepts taught, and knowing how they link to other concepts in a developmental progression. So in other words, developing number sense and fluency, which is going to be so important. It's also about having an understanding of the likely difficulties a child might have, and how being aware of the different approaches to this will support children to overcome such barriers. It also links well with the metacognition and self-regulation that Vanessa has just been talking about, as it provides opportunities for children to explain their thinking, and we'll be able to delve deeper into this through the research. The second one is dedicating time for children to learn mathematics and integrate it throughout the day. The focus here will be research on how to create a maths-rich environment where maths is taught throughout the day, and where children can build on their learning and apply it in different aspects of the curriculum, with a particular focus around the use of stories and games, which the EEF talks about at length. We will also look at the importance of consolidating key concepts through counting, for example, while lining up, and how such strategies can transfer knowledge into the long-term memory and aid automatic recall over time. The third strand is using manipulatives and representations to develop understanding. Here we will discuss research from the Nuffield Foundation around using manipulatives to teach arithmetic, exploring the importance of how selecting a range of manipulatives, including fingers, natural resources and man-made objects, can support understanding and enable children to make links between concepts and embed knowledge. Ensuring teaching builds on what the children already know, which is the 4th recommendation from the guidance. This is more prevalent now more than ever, especially as children will have had such a varied range of experiences over the last 6 months. Here we will consider through the research how planning tasks carefully to embed understanding can also deepen thinking. Also knowing where the learning fits into the bigger picture from across early years into Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2 and beyond. We will also look at evidence around how to select tasks as a baseline for existing knowledge, which will inform teachers about possible misconceptions. And this dovetails very well with the last recommendation, the use of high quality targeted support to help children learn mathematics. The focus here will be around how to maximise progress within an intervention and how this fits in with the current classroom learning. We will use the research to delve deeper into the impact of interactive apps and other computer programs as a form of intervention. Overall, this guidance is going to be key in ensuring that children have a good understanding of number. The research that sits alongside each recommendation will provide great opportunities for those professional dialogues, both between the school-based leads attending and with staff back in your own settings. And as already mentioned, it is such a valuable document in terms of highlighting key priorities for our children, especially in terms of these challenging times. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, Rachel. Just to highlight as well that the first 5 PLCs of that project, as Rachel's just explained, will be focused on maths, and the second of those 5 PLCs will be based on the Preparing for Literacy guidance report. Is there anything you want to add to that, Rachel?
No, that's everything. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you. So I'm the research champion for mental health and behaviour, which is a new Mobilise project. It's a 10 PLC project with the first 5 PLCs really focused on mental health, and the second 5 PLCs really focused on behaviour. But as we'll go through when I talk a little bit later, they're very interlinked, and it's actually quite difficult to separate the two. Having said that, there is an option for schools if they wish to just focus on the 5 behaviour PLCs. That would be particularly appropriate for schools that have already engaged in the Emotional Health and Wellbeing project over 2 years. If they wanted to just focus on the 5 PLCs on behaviour, then that would flow really nicely on from that. But it is a 10 PLC project in its entirety. So if we think about mental health first, why do schools really need to focus on mental health? I'll just give you 30 seconds just to read some of the statistics on the slide. So I think they're sobering statistics and ones that we really do need to take note of. In 2004, 1 in 10 children and young people had a clinically diagnosable mental health condition, and now we're at 1 in 8 children. The prediction about depression that's on the screen was also accurate. That is now the most prevalent childhood disorder. In addition to the statistics we can see on the screen, and that's children in your settings in your schools, we know that we're going to have to live with the effects of COVID for some time, and it will remain our biggest challenge for the foreseeable future. The Mental Health and Behaviour project will effectively support schools to develop and embed a wellbeing response to COVID in the short, medium and longer term. Thanks, Matt. So there's 2 key documents that we're going to use to structure the mental health part of this project. The first one is on your screen. It's written by Catherine Weir in 2015, and it's a worldwide meta-analysis of research on what works in promoting social and emotional well-being and responding to mental health problems in schools. It contains some really effective approaches and advice specifically intended for schools within the document. So we'll be using that a little bit like a guidance report and continually coming back to that throughout the project. Thanks, Matt. So the second document we're going to use to structure the project is a little clip of it on the screen. You can see it's from FEE and the Young People's Mental Health Coalition, again written in 2015. So in the middle we've got leadership and management, and around the outside some of the themes again that we will aim to cover throughout the entirety of the project. Again, within that document, if you haven't had sight of it, there's lots of advice for schools and effective approaches, but all specific to the school setting. So really, really helpful document, and we'll keep coming back to that throughout the duration of the project. Thanks, Matt. So where does the Mobilise mental health and behaviour sit with national and county priorities? So on the screen there you can see the green paper, and I'm sure you're all aware of that. Underneath there, I've just listed 2 of the 3 main aims from the Green Paper that really apply to education settings. We know lots of schools in Lincolnshire do now have designated senior leads for mental health. And what the Mobilise Mental Health and Behaviour project will do is provide some quality CPD for that designated senior lead for mental health in school, or indeed any other member of the school team who has the capacity and ability to effectively implement and embed whole school change in this area. Mental health support teams. So there's currently 2 trailblazer areas for mental health support teams in Lincolnshire, one in Lincoln and one in Gainsborough. And we know that the intention is that those are increased. So there's likely to be more pockets of that within Lincolnshire, schools being able to access mental health support teams. So they are NHS staff working collaboratively with schools, and they will come into schools and lead interventions on a group or one-to-one basis with pupils in schools. But mental health support teams also really strongly recommend that schools also implement a whole school approach to emotional health and well-being as a universal approach, recognising that supporting the well-being of children and young people is not just about an intervention, it's about actually everybody in the whole school community having a role to play within that. So Mobilise Mental Health and Behaviour is an 18-month project focused on supporting schools to really develop that tiered approach to emotional health and well-being, with the focus being on getting that universal provision right, creating healthy, happy and thriving school communities, whilst also reducing the need for lots of targeted interventions and agency referrals. Evidence suggests whole school change can take 2 to 4 years to fully embed. And it also suggests that effective CPD to support development and sustain change is not one-off CPD but long-term, involves the whole staff team and is followed up by mentoring and coaching when appropriate. And that's why all of our Mobilise projects are long-term projects, and we promote the use of shadow PLCs back in school. RSHE, we know statutory from September, but due to the pandemic, schools have now got until April 2021 at the latest to implement the new RSHE curriculum. We will look at this through Mobilise by thinking about mental health through the curriculum, and we'll be using the Improving Social and Emotional Learning in Primary Schools guidance report to really support this RSHE curriculum. That is a primary school specific guidance report, but absolutely the strategy shared within there and the research that underpins that is very suitable for secondary schools to consider, and special schools and AP absolutely as well. Finally then, you may have already had an email about this, the rollout of the Wellbeing for Education Return CPD. So that's a national rollout of CPD. It will be for 1 or 2 leads in your schools, most likely that senior designated lead for mental health. And I've been trained to be a trainer for that programme as well. So what Mobilise will do is complement that CPD and really provide that long-term support to your leads in school to help them to develop and embed a whole school and targeted approach to mental health and behaviour. Thanks, Matt. So on the screen then, a list of our Mobilise friends, and if you joined us for any sessions during lockdown, you may well have met some of these representatives from these agencies in those meetings. So we've been really, really lucky. Agencies and services in county have been really generous with their time and often come along to mental health and behaviour and emotional health and wellbeing PLC meetings to join in the professional discussion, sometimes to lead presentations and updates about their agencies, and also to support schools with action planning. In addition to that, Mobilise schools, emotional health and wellbeing schools have been in the past offered some pilot projects to take part in. For example, we've had a 5 Ways to Wellbeing project, really thinking about 5 ways to wellbeing through a curriculum offer, and that's been a joint project between Mobilise and Mindspace Stamford, and that was offered to our Stamford cluster of schools engaged in emotional health and wellbeing. BOSS and Restorative Solutions also offered 2 of our clusters the opportunity to engage in a Restorative Schools project, which was an 18-month project, which is still ongoing. And Healthy Minds offered Mobilise schools the opportunity to have support to train pupil wellbeing champions. There's lots of evidence around peer support for mental health in schools, and they were supporting those schools in developing their pupil wellbeing champions, and that's still ongoing as well. So as part of this project, we're really lucky that we are working in a multi-agency way across the county. There will be support in those meetings and possible further opportunities for schools to consider as well. Thanks, Matt. So if we think about mental health PLC, so the first 5 meetings really focused on mental health, and the bullet points there just go through what we're aiming to cover over those 5 meetings. They are subject to change, as always, depending on the current context and also in light of any new evidence that may become published. But that's the aim for the 5 PLCs for mental health. I'm just going to talk a little bit about staff wellbeing and development, just to share a little bit of my thinking around what that might involve as part of the project. So when we've looked at whole school approach evidence over the past 3 years with school, and that's really looked at a wide range of things in terms of what we might think about for a whole school approach to mental health and wellbeing. Over 90% of the time, what schools and school-based leads have really wanted to talk about is staff wellbeing. So there's so much in there that needs to be addressed, but staff wellbeing is something people really want to talk about and really want to address. There's a quote in bold on the screen, feedback from school leaders in Lincolnshire at the moment, highlighting staff wellbeing being a real concern at the moment. And I think as well, staff, you know, the well-being of school leaders at the moment is a real concern as well. If we have a look at the evidence suggests that workload and the pressures of the profession have a significant impact on staff well-being, as well as difficulties reported with teachers in managing pupil behaviour. The 2019 Teacher Wellbeing Index published findings that said 72% of educational professionals describe themselves as stressed, rising to 84% of senior leaders, and 78% of educational professionals have experienced behavioural, psychological or physical symptoms directly linked to their work. I think it's vital that we really start to address staff wellbeing holistically, not as a tick box exercise. It's not about those nice wellbeing touches like cake on a Friday, although I think cake always helps. Thanks, Matt. So I just wanted to share with you a quote from John Tomsett taken from his new book, Putting Staff First, that was published this year. So he says that one of the most obvious truisms about schools is that when it comes to educating students, teachers are your greatest resource. Any head teacher who explicitly puts the students first hasn't thought that decision through. The implication is that teachers are less important than students. The best thing for students is a happy, motivated staff. By putting the staff equal first with the students, you are doing the best you can do for the students. And he said that in 2015. 5 years on, so in writing his new book, John has expressed the need to take this idea further now by quoting Michael Fullan in 2008, who noted that children first stances are misguided. By putting staff first, you're well on the way to providing for students the one thing that will help them to make good progress in their learning, truly great teaching. And he suggests that now we need more than just happy and motivated staff. We also need well-qualified, hard-working, well-trained experts who, in return for the best working conditions we can provide, accept the professional obligation to improve their classroom practice. So in Mobilise, in this project, what we're going to aim to do is build on the session we led during lockdown on staff wellbeing, which really looked at an organisational trauma-informed approach that would support everybody's wellbeing within that organisation to include staff. But in addition to that, we will address some key areas through a staff-first lens. So particularly thinking about recruitment of staff, development of staff, and how we aim to retain good teachers. And just one of the ideas that John Tomsett outlines in his book, which I think is really interesting, is that move away from performance management and performance-related pay to performance development and ensuring that we prioritise effective teacher learning. So just a few ideas there about what we might cover, what we're going to aim to cover in the staff wellbeing part of the Mental Health and Behaviour project. Thanks, Matt. So this is the second part of that project then, focused on behaviour. So there will be 5 PLC meetings focused on this, and you can see the 6 recommendations from the guidance report on the screen. This is applicable to all phases, so 4 to 18, it states in the guidance report. And when we're talking about behaviour, the guidance report takes that to mean supporting pupils with high behaviour needs, pro-social behaviours and learning behaviours as well. So as we said before, this is part of the Mental Health and Behaviour project, but this could be a 5 PLC project as a standalone as well. So why is behaviour in a project with mental health? It's in recognition all distressed behaviour is a communication of something, and it's often an indication of an unmet need, in which case being curious about what's driving the behaviour is important. When we understand, we can then seek to support that child or young person much more effectively. Interestingly, the definition of discipline means to teach. But when we hear the word discipline, I think we tend to think about strict rules and consequences, but the word actually means to teach. Strict zero tolerance approaches support short-term compliance, but they very rarely lead to long-term learning. These approaches can also cause long-term damage to our most vulnerable and traumatised and often already isolated children and young people. The recommendations in the guidance report urge caution over using zero tolerance approaches, warning schools to think carefully about unintended consequences of such approaches and the possible link to unnecessary exclusions. The guidance suggests that relational approaches are effective and that relationships actually underpin all 6 of the recommendations within the guidance report. Recommendation 1 in light blue on the screen highlights the very strong evidence base, which demonstrates that teacher-pupil relationships are the key to good behaviour, and these relationships can positively affect pupil effort and attainment as well. I think it's really important to develop a joined-up approach where mental health and behaviour values, practice and policies align. Where pastoral and behaviour systems are not highly convergent, this leads to a huge variability in the treatment of behavioural incidents, and there's no consistent whole school approach. I think it's important to put the Fee model, the Catherine Weir reading, and all of our ideas around mental health side by side with behaviour, and make sure that those 2 approaches do fit really well together, they complement each other, and they work alongside each other as they're supposed to. Thanks, Matt. So just to highlight again, one of the things that we will focus on within the Behaviour project, teaching learning behaviours. And several high quality studies have suggested that a shift from focusing on managing behaviour to actually teaching learning behaviours might be beneficial. So learning behaviours are about building long-term protective factors for deeper learning. And a learning behaviour is any behaviour that supports learning. And on the screen, you can see that they're split into emotional, social and cognitive behaviours. So just to give you a few examples of what we're talking about. Emotional, so we're talking about things like mental well-being, dealing with setbacks and self-esteem. Social, relationships, collaborative learning and bullying. And cognitive, motivation, growth mindset and communication. And the evidence suggests that when these learning behaviours are taught and they're really well developed, they become essential life skills, impacting on self-esteem and mental well-being. Teaching these effective learning behaviours allows teachers to teach in safe classrooms, enabling self-regulated learning, while fostering positive, proactive relationships with and between pupils, teachers and families. Successful learning behaviours rely on bringing all the areas that you can see around the Pentagon together to wrap around every child in our schools. And within the guidance report, there's lots of useful information around this, and a little video clip to share some more information around this as well. But teaching learning behaviours is a really important part of this project, and something we will definitely focus on in one of those PLC meetings. Thanks, Matt. So emotional health and wellbeing 2 is specifically for schools that have taken part in Emotional Health and Wellbeing 1 this year. So they've done half of the project, remembering though the disruption of the pandemic through lockdown. So schools that have done year 1 have the opportunity to complete the project. So 5 PLCs to complete this project in full then. The themes on the screen are what we are aiming to cover in year 2. And that's because the other themes have been covered already in year 1. Again, they're subject to change depending on context and any new evidence which arises. So in year 2, we're aiming to still focus on whole school approaches, but I'm also going to just talk briefly about targeted support and intervention, which is highlighted on the screen. And we will absolutely be focusing on that as well within the project. So we know that early intervention is really, really important. I think the bit that schools often want to know more about is which intervention would be most useful. Have we got training available? Are there resources available? Is there support for staff to deliver those interventions effectively? The evidence suggests schools often don't provide interventions that are intense enough or long enough to make a long-term difference and to sustain the impact. Some short-term interventions that last for 6 to 12 weeks have been shown to be effective for some conditions, for example, social skills or anxiety, but often more intense interventions with more sessions a week tend to work better. And interventions, it suggests in the evidence, that last sometimes from 9 months to a year are what's really needed for deeper and broader areas to improve things like well-being and behaviour. Early intensive intervention, followed by regular revisiting of core learning in a developmentally appropriate way, and with booster top-up sessions for older students, has also been found to be an optimum approach. ELSAs, which we've promoted through the Emotional Health and Wellbeing Project, and we've worked with Futures in Mind as well, they deliver that training, is another evidence-based approach that schools in Lincolnshire have been taking advantage of, and that has been having a really positive impact in schools. Healthy Minds will support Mobilise clusters with this PLC. They'll provide further information and support to schools within that PLC meeting, and the possibility then of some referral to extra resources and things like that as well. But that second year really will embed the work that's been done in year 1 of the project. And again, it's very much around working collaboratively with county agencies and services to really make sure that schools have got a very well-rounded whole school approach to mental health and behaviour. Thanks, Matt.
Okay, we're now going to hear from Steve Wilshaw, who's the research champion for improving literacy in secondary schools, whose presentation was recorded a couple of weeks ago. Thanks, Matt.
One of the things that I think is really exciting about this is that it's an opportunity to work on something over a really extended period of time. Far too often in schools we try to do things in ways which are far too quick to ever be realistic, and having 2 years to really attack this is, I think, a really good opportunity. I was drawn to a little bit in the introduction to Jeff Barton's Don't Call It Literacy, where he's talking about the kind of collective sigh that you might get if you mention that you're going to do some CPD around literacy in a staff room, and people saying things like, oh, haven't we already done that? And he says, if we had done literacy, we wouldn't have youngsters who misread basic written accounts of events, who haven't the resilience to read to the end of a text of, say, 800 words, and who lack the strategies that you and I would take for granted in reading a leaflet for specific advice, scamming, or an article for the gist, skimming, or who would think the idea of sitting down with a book in their hands and alien and perverse activity. So that's something about why this is important, why it's still an ongoing issue for the students in our schools. I don't think any of us could honestly say that we've achieved literacy. We've got literacy to a point where probably in any school in the country where it really should be. And just to go back to that point about English, and it's not just about English, it seems to me that literacy is about speaking, listening, writing and reading, and that combined, those are the components of thinking. And thinking is something that's important in all subjects, and I don't think any head of department or any teacher is likely to say that thinking isn't relevant to them. So, as we said, this isn't on one-off, it's ongoing, it's going to last 2 years, and it's about participants working together as part of this group to challenge one another and improve their planning and their implementation of the work that they want to do to improve literacy in their own schools. It's very much about a collaborative enterprise. Could you just go on to the next slide, please, Vanessa? So Mobilise requires leadership, support and engagement. All my experience tells me that things don't work unless they've got support from leadership. When I was working for CFBT, I wrote the Rooted in Reading resources, sorry, can't get my words out. And as part of that, I wrote a research report which looked into what made it effective in some schools. And one of the key things that seemed to make the difference to whether it impacted on the amounts of reading that happened was the amount of support from leadership that it got. So that's a really key element. This isn't going to have any impact unless it's got support from the highest possible level within the school. And the school-based lead needs to be somebody who's got some clout, and also probably needs to have the head's ear in order to be able to implement the changes that they may need to make. Literacy needs to be something that's part of the ADP, or it's going to be sidelined. If it's not part of the school's priorities, then whoever the person is who's acting as the school-based lead isn't going to be able to get things changed. And it's going to need resources of time, energy, and probably money in order to make things different, make things better. You can't expect somebody to just be a sort of lone warrior making these changes. It needs that kind of support. And within the school, both within the cluster and within the group of people who are going to be working on this, we need a sense of collective endeavour, and that needs to transfer into the school. So it's a major improving literacy. We know it's been attempted before loads of times within schools, with sometimes greater and sometimes lesser success. So it is a major and daunting challenge, and at a time now when we've got massive other major and daunting challenges. But on the other hand, if we're successful, it can have the rewards could be huge. It could lead to improved teaching and learning in all our subject areas. It could lead to better exam results across all subjects. It could lead to better communication in school and out of school, resulting in improved mental health for not only our students but for our teachers as well, I think. And therefore better life chances for our young people. Their economic, social, political and emotional health could benefit from all this and from this work. And I don't think there's ever been a time when that's been more important. So if we move on to the structure, as Vanessa's already said, there'll be 10 sessions. And they will run across the 2 years, and that gives us a really serious amount of time to get things moving and to develop things, to really begin to build these ideas up and hone the plans and adapt them as we're going through the 10 sessions, and build in the outcomes from the reading and the research that we look at as we go through. We can move on to the next slide, actually, please. Have we jumped to there? Is there a what is? Well, it doesn't matter. So a PLC is going to involve a piece of reading, a piece of research. We'll go on to look at what some of those might be in a minute. And Then it will involve, right, sorry, right, okay. Which one are we going for? That one, right. Okay, so these are the EEF Improving Literacy in Secondary School recommendations. As you can see, there are 7 of them, and that lends very neatly to the focus for the first 7 of the 10 sessions. My plan is that the last 3 we will leave until we get to that point, and we'll see what the needs of the group are, and we'll then tailor them to meet the needs of the group. The first one is about the whole concept of disciplinary literacy, which is quite a new concept in the UK at least. I don't think it was widely discussed before the report came out, and we will, I think we probably skipped over that slide, but basically in that first session, we'll spend quite a bit of time looking at and talking about that piece of research from which the idea of disciplinary literacy emerged, and we'll talk about things like, what does good geographical writing look like or sound like? What does clear scientific speech sound like? What does it mean to listen like a historian? And how can schools and how can teachers model those things in ways which enable students to understand them and to better achieve them themselves? The scope of the recommendations is huge. They cover all of the main elements of literacy. They cover vocabulary, reading, writing, speaking and listening. Listening often a bit left out, a bit of a poor relation really, it seems to me. And then finally move on to intervention. So a whole gamut of skills there that make up secondary literacy, but also the skills which are so vital for effective learning in every secondary subject. One thing I'd like to pull out of all this is the interrelatedness of these skills. So the relationship between speaking and writing, and the particular that idea that boys in particular need to be able to rehearse their ideas in speech first before going on to writing. The relationship between reading and writing, and how far too often we ask students in school to write something without asking them to read examples of that same kind of writing first themselves. And the relationship between reading and speaking, and how do we read something and then talk about it in an effective way. So literacy is a complex and nuanced system, and it's going to take time, and we need to give students time to nurture those skills. As I say, the plan is to be responsive to the group's needs in the last 3 sessions, focusing on things that come out in the first 7 as being areas of general concern that are worth spending additional time on. Could we go back to this one that's headed Structure of PLC Sessions, just to look at that in a bit more detail? Yeah, that's the one. Okay, so the normal structure for the PLCs from number 2 onwards anyway, when people are coming with a plan themselves, is that we will spend some of the time focusing on their plans, getting people to talk about the plans that they've got, what are their school priorities in terms of literacy, and what progress have they made since the previous session, what have they done in terms of implementing their plans since then. And the aim will be to get everybody contributing to the group and the discussion, feeding in ideas that will improve the plans going forward and help everybody to make sure that their work is as good as it possibly can be. This is very similar to the model that we used during the course of last academic year for the peer improvement pathway. I was a hub lead for the LTSA schools and worked with 2 clusters of schools working on planning, implementation and development of their own plans through the PIP. And this is very similar kind of model, people working with each other to improve their plans. Then in each session we'll then be talking about the particular EEF recommendation that we're looking at in that session. There'll be some reading which will have been done beforehand, short piece of work. It could be a piece from a book, it could be a blog, it could be something, well, that's probably what it's likely to be, a piece from a book or a blog. But it'll be fairly short, it'll be accessible, but it will hopefully pose some questions and pose introduce some new thinking, which will facilitate and enable people to think about their own plans and think about maybe ways in which they could develop their plans in order to incorporate these ideas. So there'll be time to discuss, facilitate a discussion of that piece of reading and how it might link to what's going on in their own particular schools that are present. Okay. Can we jump down to the one that says plan for PLC 1? Yeah. So PLC 1 will be slightly different, as I've said before, because people will be coming in from a slightly different perspective. So they may not have plans at this point. So we'll talk about what are the school's shared literacy priorities. We'll share the school's literacy priorities, and it'll be interesting to see how varied they are, whether they're all quite similar or whether they're very different. And then, as I mentioned before, we'll focus on that particular piece of work by Shanahan and Shanahan, what is disciplinary literacy and why does it matter? The focus will be on sharing, beginning to understand each other's priorities, as it's only in this way that we can begin to have positive impact on each other's work. I was struck by this sentence that I read in a book recently about the notion of the intelligent office, but I think it's relevant to this. Our acceptance of the dignity and role of collaboration should be founded on a basic recognition of the fact that big tasks demand a symphony of different skills. And the people who are going to be part of this will be all bringing their different skills to the group and contributing to the development of each other's plans. So in this first PLC, there'll be extended reading around the issue of disciplinary literacy and also some discussion about what it means to be part of a CLC. I think this next slide, how it's going to quite work. It was, all right, okay. I'd put in a load of animations so each of these came up one at a time, but there we go. So as well as the research referenced in the report, during the CLCs, we'll use a range of other stimulus materials. We'll look at things like blogs by Barbara Blyman and James Duran, who've written extensively about the role of knowledge and the role of vocabulary in understanding and reading. Blogs by people like Ian Cushing on how schools police language use, and excerpts from important books on literacy, and you can see some of the possible ones there. Tried to cover quite a wide range, so we've got books, obviously the very almost ubiquitous Quigley books on vocabulary and reading gaps. Lemov is very interesting on reading, particularly the importance of reading aloud and the importance of reading non-fiction in classrooms. Marianne Wolf writes very interestingly about how we build more resilient readers, and how she feels digital literacy needs to be developed in parallel with other forms of literacy, because otherwise we're in danger of creating a whole load of young people who just don't have the resilience to read longer texts. The Writing Revolution, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and that has some very interesting ways in which Hochman in America has developed very useful little techniques for improving the effectiveness of students' writing that can be applied in a whole range of different subjects. And then at the bottom, and because it's important not to forget, which perhaps they shouldn't be at the bottom therefore, not to ignore speaking and listening. I think it's perhaps tends to be a bit ignored sometimes. We've got the English Speaking Union there and Voice 21, both of which are involved in the development of speaking and listening within schools and have important things to say, contribute to that debate. So we'll cover some of their materials as well. So we'll touch on key writing linked to the main elements of literacy, and hopefully those will all then begin to be involved in schools' plans as we move forward.
Okay, so just to highlight then, as part of the Mobilise project, there is free access to the Mobilise website, where there are lots of resources for each project. The resources are contributed by schools, agencies and services in Lincolnshire, and also created by the Mobilise team. So lots of things on there for each project, so past projects and for the new projects. We will make sure that there's a specific area for the new projects as well, but lots and lots of useful things on there that you can use to support your PLCs back in school and the development of your projects. Thanks, Matt.
Okay, so final bit, and the bit you're probably most curious about, which is how does the new traded model work? So we're very grateful to the LLP for having funded Mobilise 100% for the first 4 years, but that's now come to an end, so we are having to switch to a traded model. So the cost to schools has been worked out at £7.50 per pupil, but that is up to a maximum of £2,875 and a minimum of £400 for smaller schools. So this will entitle your school to take part in either 1 or 2 projects, and this you will only pay once up until the end of July 2022. So there are no further payments due or charges up until the end of July 2022. And you can see there a range of ways in which you can pay, depending on whether you're an academy or not, to fit around your budget. Schools might also want to consider using your catch-up premium to cover the cost as well. That could be used if you wanted to use that in this initial year while we have that coming into schools. And it's also worth bearing in mind that if you're thinking of putting someone forward as a cluster lead, then their attendance at the base camp training prior to each PLC is in fact covered, paid, so you will have that money if you wish to have a cluster lead from your school who can generate some income for your school as well. So I'll just give you a minute to look at that. We do have some schools currently that are involved in 3 or even 4 projects from the larger, particularly the larger secondary schools. There is a option to do that, and the additional cost, it would be an extra 25% on top for schools that want to do 3 or more projects. But obviously it's very much dependent on the capacity of your school to be able to do that. Thanks, Matt. So just to say, the registration is now open. The link's on there as well as on the homepage of the Mobilise website. And you can just go on to the next slide, Matt, just to highlight for you, contact details are there. And again, they're on the homepage of the Mobilise website if you want to get in touch with any of the research champions directly or through the central team to ask any questions. But we will now pause this recording so that you can unmute yourselves and put your cameras on, and we'd like to invite you to ask questions of any of the research champions. Thanks, Matt.